Hi, it's David Taylor here, and I just want to talk about something a little difficult, but I think necessary to talk about today. And it's about our children, our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren. You know, I like to talk about Old Testament characters frequently, and Noah strikes me on this one. You know, I've talked about Noah before, and I'll probably continue to talk about Noah, but this really strikes me. When you look at Noah's grandchildren, and even Ham, and then you look at his great-grandchildren, it's like, what happened? Right? Here you have one of the most righteous people that ever walked on the face of the earth, and that can't be stressed enough, right? Because sometimes we wonder and we go, where did we go wrong? Because we look at our children, our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren. But literally, they had Noah as an example of godliness, a man that stood out in his generations, that found favor in the sight of the Lord. They had him as their example of godliness. They knew that their lives had been preserved because of Noah's godliness, his own children. And yet we find that his grandchildren, his great-grandchildren, were some of the most wicked people because they were worshiping idols and everything. By the time Abraham's born, which is 2 years after the death of Noah, they're already rampant in just godlessness. And it's like, what happened? What happened? And so then I started thinking about King David. How did King David's children turn out? Not so great, did they? Right? Like, you have murder, you have rape, you have incest. And Solomon is the best example. Now, before you start beating up on Solomon, I'm pretty sure most of us aren't even as righteous as Solomon, but Solomon is the best example. And David was a man after God's own heart. And you see that murder, and you see the rape, and you see everything else. And you're like, what happened? What happened? And then you go to the priest Eli. How about his children? Didn't turn out so good. How about Samuel's children? Didn't turn out so good. And it got me thinking. You know, we often as believers think that, our children are somehow born with righteousness and our righteousness. And we're actually thinking wrong. Our children are born sinful. Our children are born with a sin nature, not in relationship with God, but in enmity with God. They are born in sin. They don't inherit righteousness. And, we think that our children are going to be, all great. And, there's even this blindness of, they said a prayer when they were children, even though they're living in open, defiant sin. Open, defiant sin. Like premarital sex and fornication and all kinds of other things. Defiant, with no fear of God. And yet we'll sit back and say, well, I know they said a prayer when they were, 8. And it's wrong. Because this is what I've realized. And, I'll use this story because it's kind of funny. My son Ethan was at the Walmart with my wife. And he was... couldn't keep his hands off of anything. And so my wife is like, okay, let's get some McDonald's. So they're sitting in the McDonald's. She finishes eating. And as soon as she goes to throw something out, so as soon as she's occupied, Ethan takes that advantage of that, comes up with this diabolic plan, executes it, and then exceeds the limitations of, the human body. It's just like when you turn around, what does a child do? It's incredible what they can accomplish in such short period of time, right? Like they devious plan, execute it, and their body works without explanation. Well, this is what happens. So Sarah made that mistake where she was too occupied and she couldn't do anything about it. And Ethan just took advantage of that and pulled the fire alarm. Lights go off. And sirens, and the fire truck shows up, and my wife is quite frazzled by this. And so when I get home, she tells me about it, and she's still pretty frazzled by this and embarrassed by it. And so I go to talk to our son, Ethan. And, I'm like trying to scold him. But in the back of my head, I'm laughing. Right? Because the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. I pulled the fire alarm when I was a kid, too. So not much different in age than he is now. So, when you realize that the apple doesn't fall far from the tree, we're talking about bad things in general. Because that's what we pass on to our children, is we pass on a sin nature. We don't pass on our obedience. We don't pass on righteousness. And even in terms of sanctification and everything else, we're born again, we're new creatures. But when we have a child, like my wife and I are both new creatures, when we have our child, are they born with the same freedom that we are? No. They're born in a sin nature. And we need to remember that. That's an important key to remember, that our children are born in a sin nature. Because we need to afford every opportunity, every advantage that we possibly can for our children. And I say that firmly. Let me put it this way. I heard a statistic that says 60 to 80% of the kids that grow up in the church today, once they finish university or college or whatever, where they step out on their own, never return to their faith. 60 to 80. I have 3 children, which means maybe one of them might serve God, might have the same faith as me. 1 out of 3. Or 1 out of 4. And yet, if we were to give that message and share that in front of a church, and let's say the youth group, there was only 11 kids or 10 kids. Do you realize that means that only 2 to 4 of those youth, once they leave home, they're never going to come back to the church. But yet every parent who's sitting there assumes that it's going to be their children. But statistically, that's impossible. So I just want that to sink in for a second. We have kind of a crisis on our hands, but we also need to realize that every man is a blank slate and woman before God, right? You cannot make the decision for your children. And you know that because you made a decision for yourself. You put your faith and your trust in the Lord Jesus Christ, right? It wasn't your parents. You were born at enmity with God. So are your children. And your children have to make that decision. Now, their exposure does likely increase their willingness to respond favorably to the Word of God, but there's no guarantee. Once again, look at Noah. Look at David. There is absolutely no guarantee. Just because you might be a pastor, just because you might be a missionary, just because you might be an elder or a deacon, statistically speaking, a godly heritage is rare. So my first point kind of to say here is that I know there's people that are wearing that and they feel like they're responsible for their children. Trust me, even if Noah was their parent, if they want to reject, they're going to reject. Look at Cain and Abel. They literally knew that they were the first children. And yet Cain, knowing God, going through even sacrifice, even talking to God. And God even says, if you do right, would I not accept you? Meaning that Cain knew what was right, and he still rejects God and becomes the first apostate. Like, let that sink in. We need to pray, and we need to afford every possible advantage to our children today. We need to stop thinking about ourselves and being like, oh, well, why didn't the pastor visit me? Well, you've overcome the world. You know what's ahead for these children and these youth. You know what's coming. You know you've overcome it. So why are you worried about yourself? You should be worried about those kids and those youth, because they're about to face a world ahead of them. So I want to encourage you, if you know youth in your church, and there's youth in your church, or you know a family that has youth, it could be a part of another church, because we're not the days of big youth groups are kind of over. I remember being a part of a youth group that was over 100. Those days are over. So, at least in towns of the size that I grew up in. Now, they might still exist in big cities, and so I'm not talking about that. But if you're older and you've overcome, you should be dedicating yourselves to praying for the children and the youth that you know. Start being dedicated to them, because they need every ounce of prayer. If you have time, you're an older person, maybe invite them over. And maybe invite them out and buy them lunch. Right? Actually, this is what worship is. Maybe save your money so that you can then, like you might be saying, oh, well, I live on a fixed income. Well, then maybe set some money aside and make it your mission that you want to love these people, and you want to love them freely, and you want them to know that you love them. So set aside some money. Take them out for lunch. Be a blessing to them, right? Because they belong to God. So that they know that there's somebody praying for them. They know that there's somebody that they can talk to. Maybe have them over for supper. Like, don't invite the parents, just invite the youth and have them over for supper or lunch after church. And just take time and just hear them out, hear what their struggles are, and then ask them. And this is a big thing. You'll hear this from me often. Learn to pray for people intelligently. Ask them, what do you need prayer for? Can I pray for you? Kind of pursue that. So invite them over and say, hey, how can I pray for you? Because intelligent prayer is just wise, right? Like, instead of being like, and I pray for so-and-so, find out how, what their needs are, what's valuable to them, and what's going on in their life. Be invested in people. Really take ownership of this, of the youth and the children, and be a support to them. Now, they might never ask you theological questions. You might not have that mentor-type relationship. You can't force that. But you can be a support to them. You can be a prayer partner to them. And that value could completely change their life, where they are no longer alone when they're faced with this world. But now they have help. So I just want to encourage you. Remember, we're all born at enmity with God. You can't pass on righteousness. You can model it, absolutely. But every child is free to make their own decision whether they want to accept Christ or not. Now, I know I'm getting into some area where people might be like, oh, da, 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 da. Regardless of what we believe here on the actual order of salvation, put that aside. But realize that these children, they need prayer. They need us to support them, because that sin nature is what's separating them from God. And they're about to face the world. And we want them to overcome. We want what's best for them. So I'd encourage you, get involved. Love the youth. Pray for the youth and the children. Because we have a crisis. That's it.